He was just a retired Marine, a man chasing peace along the quiet docks of Pelican Bay, Florida, until a rusted 1960s yacht named the Sentinel changed everything. Inside its rotting hull, Ethan Cole found his father's ghost, a coded confession, and a conspiracy buried by time and money. What began as inheritance became a mission and a reckoning. Stay until the end, because this true American mystery will test what loyalty really means. Like, share, and subscribe if you believe some secrets don't stay buried forever. The outboard coughed like a stubborn old man and died in a hiss of fuel. Ethan Cole wiped his hands on a red shop rag and listened to the afternoon settle over the bay. The tin roof of the marina shed ticked under sun gulls, scissored the air, and somewhere in the live oaks a wind chime made a quiet, friendly sound. He liked this hour, the work done, the light slanting a day measured in bolts, loosened, and seals replaced. Simple things stayed fixed if you treated them with respect. His phone vibrated on the workbench, rattling against a box of spark plugs. Unknown number. He almost let it go to voicemail. Peace had become a habit. Then he answered. Ethan Cole. The voice was crisp, practiced coastal. Mr. Cole, my name is Abigail Stone, executor for the estate of Captain William Cole. Ethan stood without realizing it, the rag clamped in his fist. He had not heard his father's name spoken with that much formality in 30 years. The shop's fan hummed. His mouth went dry. I'm listening. Your father passed 2 weeks ago, Ms. Stone said, tone gentler now. I'm sorry for your loss. His will names you sole heir to a personal vessel moored at Pelican Bay Marina, along with certain effects. Ethan's eyes found the bay through the open door. Flat water, greenish and familiar boats ticking in their slips. The name Pelican Bay scraped a memory, his father's voice teaching him knots on a hot summer dock diesel in the air. He had been 16 the last time. I wasn't aware he was still in Florida, Ethan said. The executor paused, careful with words. He moved around. The marina manager can meet you after 5. If you can come today, we can go over the documents on site. Ethan looked at the wall clock shaped like a marlin. 4:30. He heard himself say yes. When he hung up, he stood a long moment, the shop's smells of oil and salt and rope wrapping around him like old cloth. He had buried people in uniform and learned how to fold grief into neat corners, but this was different grief with splinters. He cleaned the bench, turned off the lights, and locked the door by habit, then drove the old Ford along the narrow road that braided through scrub oak and pastel houses toward the marina. The late sun blistered the water with silver. A spaniel in a pickup bed barked once as he passed like a quick salute. Pelican Bay Marina had 2 faces, the polished rows near the street where charter boats gleamed under fresh wax, and farther out the long quiet fingers of dock where boats went to wait out their endings. The office was a low building with flaking paint and a bulletin board full of hand-lettered notes about bait and lost coolers. A faded American flag snapped and fell. Snapped and fell. Inside, the air conditioning worked too hard. A man about 60, with a sun-bitten face and shoulders like oak posts, looked up from a ledger. Help you. Ethan Cole, he said. I think you knew my father. The man's eyebrows lifted. Will Cole? He came around the counter with a hand-out grip strong and steady. Tom Riley. I'm sorry, son. Ethan nodded. Condolences always felt too small for what they carried. Tom reached for a keyring and then hesitated. Before we walk down, there's something of your father's you need to meet. He whistled softly toward a back door. A German shepherd trotted out, coat black as wet stone at the back, tan at the legs and face. He moved with the economy of something that had been trained to think before it leaped. The dog stopped 3 feet from Ethan and looked up, ears forward, amber eyes sharp and curious. Tom scratched the dog's neck. Shadow's his name. Captain Cole brought him here when the weather turned bad last fall. Said he'd come back for him when the boat was right. Never did. He asked me to keep him if anything happened. Paperwork in the file says he's yours now. Ethan had lost men in places where sand got into your teeth and prayers sounded like radio static. He had learned to keep his face still when his heart moved. Even so, the sight of the dog put a hand on something in his chest he thought was welded shut. "Hey, boy," he said softly. The shepherd stepped forward and, without being told, sat facing him, straight-backed. Ethan lifted his palm, the old open stop he had used more times than he could count, and the dog froze eyes on his. Then, almost comically formal, Shadow lowered his head and touched his muzzle to Ethan's knuckles, a quiet acknowledgement. Tom's mouth twitched into a smile. "He doesn't do that for everybody." "Me either," Ethan said, and heard the roughness in his voice. He signed a temporary custody line for the dog and followed Tom out into the heat with Shadow matching him heel to toe. The docks spoke their usual language lines, creaking fenders sighing the soft clap of wavelets under planks. They passed big white boats with names written in gold leaf leisure. Certainty, the soft afterlife of money. Beyond those, the air grew stiller, the water darker. The boats here had peeled names and crooked stanchions duckweed thick at their transoms. At the last tee, Tom stopped and gestured. "There she is." The boat's name was stenciled in block letters that had once been proud the Sentinel. She was long and low, her lines graceful beneath the scabs of rust and salt. The chrome rails were pitted. The teak had gone gray where it hadn't blackened. Windows were crazed, one patched with a piece of plexiglass and hope. Ethan took the gangway carefully and felt it complain, a tired old house telling you where it hurt. Shadow put a paw on the slat tested, then followed silent as thought. Up close, the boat smelled like all the years she had seen old canvas, diesel, damp wood, and the stale sweetness of paper that had waited too long. There was a care to the decay cleats' wrapped lines coiled, even as time had its way. Ethan ran his fingers along the rail and felt the groove of rope and rein and hand. He lived aboard the last year, Tom said quietly behind him. Didn't go out much. Said he was fixing her up. Folks said a lot of things. Mostly he kept to himself. You know how it is with some men when the past gets heavy. Ethan did. The past had a weight and a geometry. It found the angles where you were soft and pressed. He stepped into the cockpit and stood at the helm. The wheel was worn smooth, and there, taped under the compass, a small snapshot had been tucked into the frame. Ethan at 12 with a fishing rod, awkward and proud, his father's hand on his shoulder. The tape had yellowed. He swallowed, and his vision narrowed to that square of time. Shadow sat at his heel and gave a half-breath woof, not a bark, just presence. "We can do paperwork in the office," Tom said after a beat. "Slip fees are paid through the end of the month, so there's no hurry unless you want there to be." He paid ahead. Ethan said more to himself than to Tom. He always thought about the practical things last. He glanced around the cockpit, letting his eyes make a slow inventory: winch handles, a bucket, a frayed chart book under a coil of line, the shadow of handprints where someone had scrubbed with too much bleach. A small brass plaque near the companionway read 1967 Bermuda, Good Bones. He eased the cabin door, and it resisted, swelled by humidity. It opened on a narrow main cabin where slanted light marked dust, the color of old pennies. Books leaned in a tired row, half nautical, half history. A galley held an enamel kettle and a chipped mug. On the table, a logbook lay open, the last entry a few weeks old, neat handwriting that hunched at the end as if the hand had tired. Shadow sniffed delicate as courtesy, then sat facing the far wall as if expecting someone to come out of it. "You can take your time," Tom said from the doorway. "I'll give you and Shadow a minute." When the door clicked and footsteps retreated, Ethan let his shoulders drop. He set his palm on the logbook as if he might feel a pulse through the paper. He could hear the gentle, constant sounds he had loved as a boy, water slapping the hull, the rig's small conversations, the way a boat breathed when you paid attention. He read a few lines. Weather. a list of parts, a note about a stubborn pump. Then under all that, a single sentence written in letters pressed hard enough to score the page beneath, "Make it right." He closed his eyes. He had left the Corps with more questions than scars, and the one he avoided most was the man who had taught him tide tables and left him to do the math of absence. Shadow shifted a soft weight against his boot. Ethan looked down and saw the shepherd watching him with that careful, searching intelligence dogs have when they want to understand the shape of your pain. "We'll see what he meant," Ethan said, surprised to hear the promise aloud. "We'll see." The sun slid lower. The cabin warmed and then cooled as a breeze found the doorway. Outside, a child laughed on a nearby dock, and a radio somewhere tried to catch a country song and mostly found static. Ethan ran a hand over the edge of the table and felt a burr snag his skin small and sharp. He thought about practical things because that was how you stood up inside a memory registration hull condition fuel insurance. He thought about impractical things because he was his father's son, what a man chooses to repair and what he lets break. He touched the brass plaque again and imagined the boat knew bright work like honey sails, fat with wind. A young captain with the world opening out in all directions. In his mind, the picture clicked to his father's last year tied to this slip hand stubbornly working at a future that might never come. Shadow sighed the contented sound of something that had appointed itself the keeper of the room. "You hungry?" Ethan asked. The ears lifted. He smiled despite himself. "Let's get you fed, partner." On the way out, he paused in the cockpit and looked back down the cabin. It was just a room, and it was something else, a place where a man had held on. He turned the key in his palm, felt the weight of it, and slipped it into his pocket. At the dockhead, Tom waited with a manila folder. "Temporary title transfer gate codes, the storage locker key," he said. "There's a small chest we kept for him in the back. He said you'd know what to do with what's inside." Ethan took the folder. "I doubt that he said honestly." Tom studied his face and nodded once. "You will." Shadow leaned against Ethan's leg, a quiet anchor in a shifting tide. The sun kissed the water, and the day gave up its light. Ethan looked back at the Sentinel, at the gray sweep of her deck and the stubborn way she held the line. He did not know yet about danger or the ways the past would reach. He knew only that a door had opened he had promised himself never to touch, and that he had already stepped through. The bay breathed steady as a sleeping chest. Shadow flicked an ear at some sound Ethan couldn't hear, and then settled watchful. "All right," Ethan said. "Let's go home." They walked the length of the dock together, the boat at their backs, the paper-thin margin between what was and what was coming closing like dusk. The next morning, Pelican Bay shimmered under a thin layer of fog that looked almost merciful on the worn-out boats. Ethan parked his truck near the far pier and watched a shrimp trawler move out toward open water, its wake breaking the mirrored surface. Shadow sat beside him in the passenger seat, alert but calm, as if already recognizing this place as part of his new perimeter. Ethan carried coffee in a paper cup that smelled of burnt beans, the kind of smell that belonged to early hours and hard work. He walked down the dock with Shadow pacing, even the leash loose but ready. Tom Riley was already there, patching a hose line on a nearby sailboat. When he looked up, the lines in his face deepened into something between caution and concern. "Morning, Marine," he said, nodding toward the dog. "Your boy there's been making friends with every pelican in sight." Ethan smiled slightly. "He's learning the ropes." Tom wiped his hands on a rag and motioned toward the small office shack. "Before you settle in, there's something you should know." Inside, the air smelled of coffee rope and dust. The harbor master poured himself a refill, then leaned on the counter. "Your dad was a quiet man, but not invisible. In the last few years, folks came around asking about that boat of his. Different types, men in suits, some with accents that didn't sound like Miami or Mobile. One offered cash, thick envelopes. Your father always turned them down." Ethan took a slow sip, his eyes narrowing slightly. Did they say what they wanted it for? Tom shook his head. Said they were marine collectors, historians, you name it. But they weren't boat people. You can spot boat people by their shoes. These fellas wore city shoes. The way Tom said it left no doubt it hadn't felt right. Ethan looked through the window at the Sentinel, the hull dull and streaked with time. He ever mention anything about the offers? Not a word. Only said some things are worth more than they look. Tom shrugged as if that sentence had been replaying in his own head since the funeral. Maybe he just didn't want to sell his home. Ethan nodded, though the words settled uncomfortably. He had known his father to be practical, never sentimental. Selling an old yacht should have been simple. Refusing cash offers from strangers wasn't. He finished his coffee and set the cup down. I'll take a better look at her today. Take your time, Tom said, but his tone carried a warning that lingered after Ethan stepped outside. The fog had lifted, revealing the full shape of the bay. The Sentinel sat at the far end of the pier, her reflection trembling in the wake of passing boats. Ethan and Shadow crossed the gangway. The dog's nails clicked softly against the weathered planks. Ethan ran a hand along the railing again, noticing details he had missed before: small patches of fresh paint over older rust places where the screws were newer than the fittings they held. Someone had been doing maintenance recently, and not with the precision his father once had. The thought tightened something in his chest. Inside the main cabin, morning light pushed through the cracked glass, illuminating motes that danced in the air like ash. The logbook still lay on the table where he had left it. He set it aside and moved toward the starboard wall. The scent of old varnish and damp wood filled the space. Shadow's nose twitched, and the dog began to pace, tail-stiff ears pricked. Ethan followed his gaze to a panel of wood near the small porthole. It looked ordinary except for a faint bulge in the grain, as if the panel had been replaced or repaired. When he leaned closer, he saw at 3 faint circular marks under the varnish, each about the size of a dime. Bullet scars filled and sanded, but not professionally. He touched one and felt the uneven surface. "Well, Dad," he murmured, "what were you into?" The sound of his own voice startled him. The air seemed to thicken, as if the boat were listening. Shadow gave a low growl, not deep, but questioning. Ethan crouched beside him and ran a hand over the dog's head. "Easy, partner. Let's see what's got you worked up." The shepherd's nose traced a line toward the rear bulkhead where the deck met the hull. He stopped, stared, then barked once, a single sharp sound that echoed through the cabin. Ethan checked the floorboards. One plank bore a set of fresh scratches, narrow and parallel, the kind that could come from a tool dragged in haste. He pried gently with a screwdriver. The plank lifted half an inch, revealing only dust and a fragment of paper, an old receipt from a hardware store dated 8 months earlier, signed with his father's looping hand. Under the printed list of items, sealant brass screws, epoxy. A quick note in pencil read, "Don't let them take it." Ethan turned the paper over. Nothing else. He slipped it into his pocket and replaced the board. His instincts, shaped by years of patrols and investigations that never made the news, began to stir. He had walked into enough aftermaths to recognize one now. Whatever had happened here hadn't been about renovation. It had been about protection. He searched the galley, checking cabinets and storage bins. Everything inside seemed normal: canned beans, a cracked coffee mug, a jar of salt. But the organization bothered him. The labels faced outward, each perfectly aligned. His father had been orderly, but not obsessive. Someone else had been here, someone careful enough to mimic old habits. Shadow's breathing filled the silence. Then the dog stiffened again, nostrils flaring toward the open porthole. Ethan crossed quickly and looked out. Across the narrow waterway, a man in a dark jacket stood on the deck of another boat, pretending to adjust a mooring line while facing the Sentinel. When Ethan's eyes met his, the man turned casually and walked below deck. It could have meant nothing. It didn't feel like nothing. He waited a full minute, then exhaled and rubbed Shadow's neck. "Looks like we've got company." The dog's tail brushed his leg in quiet acknowledgement. Ethan locked the cabin, checked the deck for signs of forced entry, and noticed small chips near the hatch hinges, tiny but fresh. Whoever had come aboard had known how to make it look routine. By the time he stepped back onto the dock, Tom was standing at the end, arms crossed, watching the water. "You all right?" the older man asked. Ethan nodded. "Just cleaning up inside." Tom hesitated. "You find anything odd?" Ethan met his eyes. "Odd's a matter of degree." Tom studied him for a beat, then sighed. "You got that look Marines get when they smell trouble. I've seen it before." "Maybe I just don't like surprises," Ethan said. "Then you picked the wrong inheritance," Tom answered softly. Ethan walked back toward his truck with Shadow at his side. The bay shimmered now under the sun, looking harmless, but his thoughts refused to calm. He had come here expecting rust mold and a few fading memories. Instead, he had found repairs done in secret bullet scars hidden under varnish and a stranger watching from across the water. Every instinct told him this was only the beginning. As he reached the parking lot, Shadow paused and looked back toward the Marina Ear's forward body tense. Ethan followed the gaze. The boat across the way looked empty again, curtains drawn. He felt the weight of the key in his pocket and the faint crinkle of the note against his thigh. "Let's keep an eye on things," he said. Shadow gave a short, confident bark as if to promise he already would. Ethan started the truck, the engine turning over with a steady hum, and pulled onto the coastal road. The sea stretched wide to the east, blue and endless, but his focus stayed fixed on the questions that had followed him off the dock. Whatever his father had refused to sell, someone still wanted it, and that someone was still close. The afternoon came heavy with heat, the kind that blurred the horizon and made the gulls glide slow and lazy over Pelican Bay. Ethan Cole parked his truck near the same slip and watched the light shimmer against the hull of the Sentinel. Yesterday's questions had followed him through the night, shaping his dreams into fractured scenes of his father standing at the helm, shadowed figures on distant docks, and the single phrase written in shaky pencil, "Don't let them take it." He carried a duffel bag filled with tools, a flashlight, and a small camera. Shadow trotted beside him, tail straight, nose testing the wind like he could smell the echoes of what had been. The harbor was quiet. Even Tom Riley's office looked deserted, the blinds drawn against the glare. Ethan took the key from his pocket and stepped onto the gangway. Every footfall met by the soft creak of tired wood. The boat greeted him with its usual scents, salt metal and the slow rot of forgotten paint. Inside the cabin, he opened every shutter, letting daylight spill across the surfaces. Dust shimmered like motes of memory. "All right, partner," he said softly. "Let's find what he didn't want them to have." Shadow sniffed the air and began a slow, deliberate circuit of the room. His tail moved once steady and purposeful before he crouched near the table leg and started pawing at the floorboards with quiet intensity. Ethan crouched beside him and ran his fingers along the seam between the planks. The wood felt slightly raised, the varnish newer than the rest of the floor. He used a thin blade to lift the edge, careful not to splinter it, and heard the faintest click, metal meeting metal. A small square of flooring lifted free, revealing a narrow cavity lined with tar paper. Inside sat a black waterproof case about the size of a lunchbox, edges rusted but intact. He pulled it out and set it on the table. The lock had been snapped off long ago. The case opened with a reluctant sigh, as if releasing years of silence. Inside were two objects, a small external hard drive sealed in plastic and a silver Marine Corps challenge coin etched with an unfamiliar insignia. Ethan turned the coin in his palm. One side bore the eagle globe and anchor like every Marine coin he had ever known. The other side, however, carried an inscription around the rim in fine engraved letters, "For honor beyond command." The year stamped at the bottom was 1989. the same year his father had vanished. He felt a shiver pass through his chest that had nothing to do with temperature. Shadow pressed closer, nose twitching at the scent of old metal. Ethan wrapped the items back in plastic, slid them into his duffel, and checked the cavity for anything else. There was nothing but a smear of dried epoxy along the edge, suggesting someone had tried to reseal it after opening. He replaced the plank exactly as he found it. "Good work," he murmured, giving Shadow a small pat on the shoulder. The dog wagged his tail, once eyes bright. Ethan straightened and looked around the cabin, studying it now as if every inch might hide another layer of his father's intent. His attention settled on the starboard bulkhead where yesterday he had found the bullet marks. He tapped lightly, listening. The sound came back dull, uneven, and he marked the spot in his mind. He would need heavier tools later. For now, he wanted to know whether anyone else had visited recently. He checked the latch and door frame, no new scratches. Still, the faint trace of a footprint on the gangway suggested someone had boarded during the night. He noted the tread pattern, something small and expensive, not the boots of a fisherman. He decided not to call the police. Too many unknowns would only draw unwanted attention. Instead, he turned his focus to Shadow, who had moved toward the rear hatch. The dog's ears twitched, nostrils flaring as he sniffed along the lower edge of the bulkhead. Then suddenly he froze and gave a sharp bark. Ethan grabbed his flashlight and followed the direction of the dog's gaze. Behind a coil of rope near the stern, a faint red glimmer pulsed in rhythm like the heartbeat of some hidden thing. He crouched and swept the light closer. The reflection came from a small circular device no larger than a coin wedged into the inner seam of the hull. A green sticker on its back bore a series of serial numbers. Ethan recognized the type immediately, a micro GPS tracker, military grade, designed to transmit location data via encrypted signal for months. Someone had tagged the boat not recently, but not long ago either, because the LED was still blinking steadily. "Easy," he whispered, as if the device could hear. Shadow stood tense beside him, muscles tight under his fur. Ethan used a screwdriver to pry it loose carefully, feeling resistance where marine adhesive held it in place. The device came free with a faint pop, leaving a small dent in the fiberglass. He turned it over, studying it under the beam. The model number matched something he had once used in reconnaissance ops overseas. Whoever planted it knew the equipment and knew he might find it. That knowledge sent a cold thread down his spine. He removed the battery, wrapped the unit in a rag, and placed it in his bag. Destroying it immediately would erase a clue, so he decided to keep it evidence of surveillance he could analyze later. He checked the hull around the area and found faint scrape marks, as if a small drone or diver had placed it without ever stepping on board. The precision of it unnerved him more than the act itself. Shadow sniffed the spot again, sneezed, and looked up at him expectantly. "I know," Ethan said quietly. "Someone's been close, too close." He spent the next hour documenting everything with his camera photos of the case, the coin, the GPS, and the marks along the bulkhead. His marine training came back as muscle memory records secure and assess. When he finished, the sun had tilted westward, painting the water with streaks of orange. The tide sloshed softly against the hull, steady and calm, as if indifferent to human secrets. Ethan leaned against the rail, trying to piece together a timeline. The tracker might explain why strangers had come with cash offers. If the device had been active all this time, someone knew exactly where the Sentinel was. Maybe that was why his father stayed aboard until the end, watching, guarding, or waiting for whoever wanted it to make their move. The thought deepened into a quiet ache. He had judged his father's disappearance for years, believing it to be abandonment. Now he wondered if it had been defense. Shadow rested his head against Ethan's knee, his weight grounding. "He trusted you to keep watch," Ethan said, scratching behind the dog's ear. The shepherd closed his eyes briefly, a small sign of understanding. Ethan looked back at the harbor. A pair of dolphins broke the surface near the channel markers, gliding together before disappearing again. Life kept moving unaware of the human stories tangled above it. He decided he would visit the hardware store mentioned on the old receipt, maybe learn if his father had left other clues. Before leaving, he took one last look inside the cabin. The air felt charged like a place that had remembered too much. As he locked the door, he noticed faint new scuffs near the threshold, none from him too light for Tom's heavy boots. Someone had been aboard between his visits. He pocketed the key and led Shadow up the dock, every sense awake. The setting sun caught the brass letters of the boat's name and turned them to gold. The sentinel watched them leave, silent and still holding more answers than it gave. The following morning arrived clean and bright, a contrast too sharp for the unease that had settled inside Ethan Cole. He had barely slept, his mind replaying the discovery of the hidden compartment, the strange Marine Corps coin, and the humming red light of the GPS tracker. By mid-morning, he returned to the Sentinel, this time carrying a toolbox and a plan to examine every inch of her hull. Shadow walked beside him, alert yet calm, occasionally stopping to scent the air, as if cataloging the world one molecule at a time. Tom Riley met him halfway down the dock, wiping his hands on a rag. "You've got company," Tom said, nodding toward the end of the pier. A black sedan idled there, polished to a mirror finish out of place among the weather-beaten trucks. A man stepped out, tall, silver-haired, dressed in a light summer suit. His movements were unhurried, practiced the kind that belonged to people who expected the world to make room for them. "Mr. Cole?" he asked, voice smooth, cultivated. Ethan set down his toolbox. "That's me." The man extended a hand. "Richard Hale. I represent Hale Systems, a company with interests in maritime restoration and preservation. Your vessel. The Sentinel came to our attention recently. I was hoping we could discuss a potential acquisition." Ethan shook his hand. The grip was firm, the skin cool. "You came a long way to buy an old boat. We have collectors all over the coast," Hale said easily. "Your father's yacht has a reputation and some sentimental value to our founder. I'm prepared to offer you $100,000 cash for immediate transfer." Ethan felt the wind lift the edge of his shirt and carry salt into the space between them. That's generous for a boat that hasn't left the dock in years. Hale smiled slightly. "You'd be surprised what people will pay for nostalgia." Shadow stood beside Ethan, tail low, body poised. The dog's eyes never left Hale's face. When the businessman shifted his stance, Shadow gave a quiet growl, low and controlled. Hale's gaze flicked to the animal. "Beautiful dog. Shepherds are loyal creatures." "They are," Ethan said. "They also know when something's off." For the first time, Hale's smile faltered just a fraction. "I understand sentiment," he said, tone smoothing again. "But sentiment can be expensive. Dock fees, repairs, insurance, boats like this are hungry things. I'm offering you freedom from all that." Ethan studied him for a moment, then said, "I'll think about it." Hale reached into his jacket, pulled out a card, and handed it over. "Take your time, but not too much. The market shifts." He nodded politely, turned, and walked back toward his car. The sedan's engine whispered to life, and within seconds it was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of cologne and fuel. Tom whistled softly. "That's a lot of cash for a rusting yacht." "Too much," Ethan said. He slipped the card into his pocket without looking at it. The embossed letters pressed cold against his palm. Back aboard the Sentinel, he spent the afternoon rechecking the compartments he had sealed yesterday. Everything looked untouched. The hard drive and the coin remained secure in his bag. Still, he couldn't shake the sense that something had shifted. The air felt different, heavier, as if the boat itself held its breath. He worked until dusk, running diagnostic cables along the wiring, tightening bolts that had long since given up. Shadow sat near the doorway, head tilted toward the sound of distant engines. When the sun dipped below the waterline, Ethan packed up, locked the cabin, and drove back to his small rented house on the outskirts of town. The night began quietly. He showered, ate leftover stew, and left the windows open to the ocean wind. Shadow lay near the back door asleep, but never fully at rest. Around midnight, the dog's ears twitched. He lifted his head, nostrils flaring. Then with no sound but certainty, he barked one deep, commanding note that filled the house. Ethan was on his feet instantly, his hand reaching for the flashlight on the counter. "What is it, boy?" Shadow barked again, sharper this time, and ran to the window. Ethan followed his gaze. Down the street near where his truck was parked, a figure moved dark, low, purposeful. The man stepped out of the shadow of the palm trees, paused near the truck bed, then turned toward the road leading to the marina. Ethan didn't waste time. He grabbed his jacket, pocketed his keys, and motioned for Shadow to follow. The drive back to Pelican Bay took 6 minutes, maybe less. The moonlight painted the docks in alternating silver and darkness. He cut the engine and moved quietly, flashlight off. Shadow led muscles tight under his fur. When they reached the Sentinel, Ethan noticed the lock on the hatch was still intact. He opened it slowly, stepping into the cool, stale air of the cabin. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance: the table, the logbook, the coil of rope. Yet the air carried a faint tang of something chemical sharp enough to sting the nose. He switched on the light. The floorboards near the hidden compartment were clean, too clean. He knelt and lifted the panel. The waterproof case was still there untouched, but when he checked his duffel bag, the GPS tracker was gone. He searched the rest of the cabin quickly. No forced entry, no broken locks, no missing tools. Whoever had come aboard had known exactly where to look and exactly what to take. Shadow sniffed the floor, then the air near the bulkhead. His fur bristled. Ethan recognized the scent now, the same industrial solvent used to dissolve marine adhesives. He had smelled it once before, years ago, when his unit investigated sabotage along a coastal base. He straightened slowly, scanning the narrow space. "They knew the layout," he said under his breath. "They knew my father's habits." Shadow paced toward the hatch, nose pressed to the gap where the door met the frame. The faintest print marked the step outside half of a shoe tread, small, precise city-style soles like the ones Hale had worn. Ethan felt a pulse of cold certainty. He reached for the business card still in his pocket and turned it under the cabin light. On the back, written in small blue ink that hadn't been there before, were 5 words. "Think carefully about what you keep." He stood motionless, the sound of the tide lapping against the hull filling the silence. Whoever had taken the tracker hadn't done it for money. They wanted him to know they could. He replaced the plank, locked the hatch again, and sat for a long moment on the deck beside Shadow, the night wind brushing over them both. "You were right to wake me," he said quietly. The dog rested his head against Ethan's knee, eyes still on the dark water. Somewhere across the bay, a single light winked from another boat, then vanished. Ethan looked toward it and made a decision. He would find out exactly what his father had hidden and why men like Richard Hale were willing to cross lines to get it. He turned off the cabin light, pocketed the altered business card, and led Shadow back down the dock. The air smelled faintly of ozone and risk. Behind them, the Sentinel rocked gently, whispering secrets in the dark. The next morning broke over Pelican Bay with a light wind and the sound of halyards tapping against masts. Ethan stood at the stern of the Sentinel, coffee cup in hand, staring across the harbor toward the slip where he had seen the flicker of light the night before. He had not slept. The message on the back of Hale's card had settled into his mind like a stone dropped into still water. Shadow lay near his feet, eyes open, body still. Every small sound on the dock drew his attention. Ethan's thoughts circled the same truth: whoever wanted this boat had already been aboard, had touched the floorboards, and left a silent warning. Around 9, he heard footsteps approach. The sound was confident, but unhurried, not the measured tread of Tom Riley or the nervous shuffle of a stranger. A woman's voice called softly, "Mr. Cole." He turned. The woman standing on the dock wore jeans, a white linen shirt, and the kind of expression that came from long nights reading documents no one else wanted to see. Her hair was pulled back, her eyes sharp and steady. "I'm Sarah Whitman," she said, offering a hand. "I'm with the Miami Ledger. May I come aboard?" Ethan studied her a moment, then nodded. "What does a journalist want with a worn-out boat?" "Not the boat," she said, stepping across the gangway. "The man who owned it." She glanced down at Shadow, who had risen to his feet. "And the dog, apparently." "He's not much for reporters," Ethan said. "Neither are most Marines," she replied. That earned her a small flicker of a smile from him. "What do you know about my father?" he asked. Sarah set her messenger bag on the table inside the cabin, unzipped it, and pulled out a thin folder. "Your father, Captain William Cole, was listed as a logistics officer with the Navy until 1989. After that, he vanished from public records. I'm investigating a series of defense contracts awarded to a company called Hale Systems in the late 80s and 90s, contracts connected to missing inventory, falsified manifests, and illegal transfers overseas." Ethan leaned against the bulkhead, his face unreadable. "And you think my father was involved?" "Not involved," she said quietly. "Opposed." She slid a photo across the table. It was black and white grainy, taken at a press briefing decades earlier. His father stood at a podium, the Navy insignia visible on his uniform. The date at the bottom read 1988. The caption, blurred but legible, mentioned a confidential inquiry into procurement irregularities. Ethan touched the edge of the picture. He tried to expose them. "That's what the documents suggest," Sarah said. "But the inquiry was sealed, and soon after your father resigned. Within months, Hale Systems received a new wave of contracts. Then your father disappeared." She produced another photo, this one color slightly faded. It showed a younger Richard Hale shaking hands with Captain Cole in front of a hangar. Hale's hair was dark, his smile the same. "This was taken 2 years before that hearing," Sarah said. "They knew each other well." Ethan stared at the image. The background blur of machinery, the easy camaraderie frozen in the handshake, it felt like a scene from someone else's life. Shadow stepped closer, sniffing at the photo, then gave a low growl, a deep instinctive rumble that vibrated in the narrow cabin. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Dogs usually have good judgment." Ethan nodded slowly. "He recognizes the scent of something he doesn't trust." "Then you and your father have that in common," she said. "Mr. Hale's company has been under quiet investigation for years. They fund museums, scholarships, even veterans programs, things that make them untouchable. But underneath that polish is a long trail of unaccounted shipments and missing assets. I believe your father found proof." Ethan looked at the coin he had discovered in the hidden compartment now resting in his hand. "He left something," he said. "Maybe for me to find." Sarah studied it. "That's a challenge coin, but the motto isn't standard issue. For honor beyond command. That sounds personal, not institutional." Ethan placed it back in his pocket. "He left more than that. Files, equipment, and a GPS tracker someone removed 2 nights ago." Sarah frowned. "Then you're already in the middle of whatever he started." "Seems like it," Ethan said. He hesitated, then asked, "Why come to me now?" "Because I think your father's story is about to surface again," Sarah said. "Hale Systems has a new contract pending coastal surveillance technology. If your father documented their earlier crimes, Hale can't afford that information to reappear." She opened her laptop and showed him a scanned letter. This was in a batch of declassified naval correspondence. "It's a memo from your father to a congressional subcommittee. The last line reads, 'Evidence secured. Will deliver when safe.'" Ethan felt a slow realization forming like a tide he could neither stop nor speed. "The evidence is here," he said quietly. "On this boat. That would explain why they're watching you," Sarah said. She closed the laptop and looked up. "You're not alone in this, Mr. Cole. I've dealt with people like Hale before. They don't ask twice. When they return, they act." Ethan nodded, absorbing her words. "Then we need to move first. You have copies of what you found?" she asked. "Not yet," he admitted. "But I plan to. Let me help," she said. "I know people who can decrypt files without leaving a trace." He hesitated. Trust was not something he gave easily, and years of command decisions had taught him that allies could become liabilities. Yet there was something in her tone, a steadiness that mirrored his own resolve. "All right," he said finally. "We'll start tomorrow." She gathered her things and slung the bag over her shoulder. "One more thing," she said. "Your father wasn't the only one who tried to blow the whistle on Hale's systems. 2 others disappeared the same year. I found references to a ship matching the Sentinel's description in one of their statements. If he used this vessel to move evidence, that's what they want back." Ethan followed her onto the deck. The afternoon light was turning the bay to gold. "Then they won't stop until they find it," he said. Sarah paused at the dock. "No," she said softly. "They won't. Be careful who you talk to." Shadow watched her leave tail, still eyes following until she reached the parking lot. When the sound of her engine faded, Ethan turned back toward the water. The photo of his father and Hale burned in his mind. He thought of the GPS device, the precise footprints, and the note on the back of the card. The pattern was no longer hidden. Shadow pressed against his leg, warm and solid, as if reminding him of the present. "We'll find out what he was trying to deliver," Ethan said. The dog lifted his head, ears pointed toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond the bay, thunder rolled faintly, promising another storm. Ethan looked at the clouds gathering to the east and knew the weather was not the only thing closing in. The storm began as a quiet murmur over the Gulf, a gray smudge on the horizon that thickened as the day waned. By evening, the wind had turned restless, carrying the briny scent of rain and electricity. Ethan Cole stood on the Sentinel's deck, watching the dark line of clouds advance across the water like an army with no patience for peace. He had spent the afternoon with Sarah Whitman scanning the encrypted files from the hard drive they had retrieved from the hidden compartment. Half the data had opened into ordinary logs, fuel purchases, maintenance schedules, and tide charts, but the rest was locked behind a cipher that resisted every attempt. When Sarah left, promising to meet again after the storm, Ethan remained uneasy. Shadow paced the narrow deck, his nails tapping softly against the boards. The dog lifted his head and sniffed the air, then pressed against Ethan's leg as if urging him to leave. "Not yet." "Boy," Ethan said. "Just a few more minutes." The first drops of rain came sudden and hard, striking the deck like thrown pebbles. He sealed the cabin hatch, secured the loose lines, and turned off the power. Lightning split the sky in a white seam, followed by a low growl of thunder that rolled across the bay. Inside the cabin, the light dimmed to gray. Ethan sat by the table, watching the water distort through the portholes, his thoughts circling the image of his father and Richard Hale shaking hands in that old photograph. He wondered what promises had been made that day and which of them had been broken. The storm deepened. Rain drummed the deck overhead in steady fury. Shadow lay near the door, ears twitching at every creak. Ethan dozed briefly in the chair, exhaustion catching him unguarded. When he woke, the rain had eased but not stopped. He sensed it before he heard it, the subtle wrong rhythm of a footstep against the hull. Shadow rose at once, silent but alert, his gaze fixed on the hatch. Ethan motioned him to stay low, grabbed the flashlight and listened. Another step closer this time, followed by the soft metallic scrape of someone testing the latch. The intruder was careful, skilled. Ethan moved quietly to the opposite side of the cabin, opened a drawer, and reached for the wrench he had used earlier. He cut the flashlight, leaving only the pulse of lightning through the windows. When the hatch eased open, a draft of cold air swept in, carrying the scent of wet rope and engine oil. A silhouette filled the doorway, broad shoulders, dark jacket, and a hood dripping with rain. The figure paused, scanning the cabin with the precision of someone who knew exactly where to look. Ethan stepped forward, but the next flash of lightning blinded him for an instant. When his vision cleared, the intruder was gone. The hatch hung ajar, the only sound the steady patter of rain. Shadow lunged forward, nose to the floor, following the scent trail. Ethan turned on the light. The duffel bag where he had stored the hard drive lay open, its contents scattered. The waterproof case was still there, but the hard drive was missing. Papers he had copied from Sarah's research folder were damp and torn, some pages ripped clean away. Only half the digital files remained on his laptop, the rest deleted. Whoever had come aboard had known precisely what to take and how to move without noise. Ethan checked the clock. Less than 10 minutes had passed since he had last looked. The thief had waited for the storm to mask every sound. He stepped onto the deck. Rain lashed sideways now, and wind pressed hard against his coat. He swung the flashlight toward the dock, but the beam caught only sheets of rain. Shadow barked once, sharp and urgent, and darted toward the stern. Ethan followed. The latch on the storage locker was bent pried open with a thin tool. Inside, a small waterproof camera, the kind Tom Riley used for dock security, was tilted askew. Ethan grabbed it, shielding it from the rain. "Good boy," he said to Shadow. "Let's see what they left behind." By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the marina quiet and washed clean. Tom arrived early, his raincoat glistening. "You stayed through that?" he asked, eyes widening at the sight of the broken latch. Ethan nodded. Someone came aboard during the storm. They knew exactly where to go. Tom frowned. "We've had a few break-ins before, but never on a night like that. Let's check the security feed." In the office, they dried the small camera and connected it to the monitor. The footage played in jumpy frames, rain lightning the motion of waves, and then a shadow climbing onto the dock at 2:14 a.m. The figure moved fast low, avoiding the light. The hood fell back for an instant as the intruder looked toward the boat. The camera froze briefly before catching a clear angle. A man with weathered skin, gray hair, cropped close, and a tattoo on his left forearm, an insignia Ethan knew by heart. It was the unit mark of his father's Marine battalion, the same one carved into the challenge coin he now kept in his pocket. He leaned closer, pulse rising. "Stop the frame," he said. Tom did, eyes narrowing. "You recognize him?" Ethan hesitated. The face was older than the image in his memory, harder, but the lines around the mouth, the shape of the jaw, it could have been his father. Or someone who wanted him to think so. "It's impossible," Ethan said quietly. "My father died. They told me they found his boat adrift near Cuba." Tom looked at him. "Maybe they told you what someone wanted you to believe." Ethan's hand tightened on the edge of the desk. "Or maybe someone is pretending to be him." He copied the footage onto a drive and pocketed it. "Don't mention this to anyone," he said. Tom nodded, still staring at the paused image. "Whoever that is, he said he moves like a soldier." Ethan left the office, Shadow at his heel. The sun had broken through the clouds, turning the puddles on the dock into mirrors. He walked to the Sentinel and stood at the rail, staring out at the open bay. The idea of his father being alive after all these years collided with the impossibility of it. If it truly was him, why steal the evidence? Why leave him the coin, the note, and the half-erased files? If it was not him, then someone had access to intimate details of his life, someone inside the same circle his father had once trusted. Shadow pressed his shoulder against Ethan's leg, sensing the weight of uncertainty. "We're missing half the truth," Ethan said quietly. He looked down at the water where the reflection of the boat trembled in the breeze. The tide was rising again, slow and steady, carrying the debris of the storm toward the Gulf. "Let's find the rest." He turned back toward the truck, already knowing his next step. He needed to show the footage to Sarah Whitman, and he needed to know why his father's Mark had returned from the dead. The storm had taken the files, but it had given him a face, and that was enough to start hunting. The air still smelled of storm when Ethan met Sarah Whitman again 2 days later. The marina was quiet, sky pale, and washed the sea, still restless from the wind's memory. Sarah carried her laptop and a portable drive wrapped in plastic. I managed to recover part of the encrypted data, she said without preamble. You'd better see it somewhere private. They boarded the Sentinel together. Shadow following close, his paws silent against the damp deck. Inside the cabin, Sarah connected her laptop to the remaining data Ethan had saved. Lines of code filled the screen, scrolling fast before resolving into folders labeled with naval terms and dates that matched the late 1980s. Ethan stood behind her, arms folded, watching as she clicked one open. A manifest appeared, serial numbers, shipment records, coordinates, all tagged under the name Project Guardian. Sarah's brow furrowed. These look like supply logs, but the content doesn't match Navy procurement records. They're disguising inventory, small arms components, explosives. And here Hale Systems listed as the contractor. Ethan leaned closer. My father's name is on the authorization line. His throat tightened as he read the signature Captain William Cole Logistics Division. For years he had believed his father had walked away from duty. Now it appeared he had stayed, but under a shadow. He was signing for illegal transfers, Ethan said quietly. Sarah shook her head. Or he was being used to sign them. These files are too carefully arranged. Someone made sure he took the blame if it went wrong. She opened another folder marked Audio Logs. Static burst from the speakers, followed by a click, then a man's voice, steady, measured, and unmistakable. Ethan froze. This is Captain William Cole recording aboard the Sentinel, November 14th, 1989, the voice said. If anyone finds this, it means the operation has changed course. Hale's shipments are not humanitarian aid. They're moving weapons, and the Navy contracts are forged. I've been ordered to continue under false pretenses. If I refuse, they'll go after my family. Ethan's hands tightened on the edge of the table. Sarah looked up at him but said nothing. The recording continued, the voice roughened by fatigue and salt air. I made contact with a congressional liaison. If this reaches them, the truth might survive. If not, at least my son will know I didn't sell out my uniform. There was a pause and the tone softened. Ethan, if you're hearing this, it means I failed to protect what mattered most. I chose duty over you and your mother, and that choice cost us everything. But I never betrayed the Corps. I only hid long enough to keep you safe. Forgive me, son. The static returned, then silence. The room felt smaller, the air thick with something heavier than humidity. Shadow, who had been lying near the hatch, lifted his head. His ears flicked once at the sound of the voice. Then he rose, moved closer, and pressed his head against Ethan's leg. A low, trembling sound came from the dog's throat. Not fear, but recognition. He remembered that voice. He had been Captain Cole's dog once, trained by the same hand, taught to respond to that calm authority. Ethan knelt beside him, resting a hand on the dog's neck. You knew him, he whispered. Shadow's tail moved once slow, uncertain, and his eyes fixed on the speaker as if expecting the man to return. Sarah closed the laptop gently. There's more, she said. Half the logs reference off-book shipments through the Gulf transported aboard the Sentinel. It wasn't just his command, they used this vessel as a covert carrier. That's why Hale wants it. Somewhere on this boat is the last link tying his company to those operations. Ethan stood moving to the porthole. The water outside rippled with a faint breeze. So my father was forced to move the weapons, then tried to expose Hale. When he couldn't, he disappeared. Or someone made him disappear, Sarah said. But the recording suggests he knew he might need to vanish to keep you safe. Ethan's mind raced through fragments of memory. His mother's silence, the folded flags at the memorial, the sealed file that had declared his father lost at sea. "He wasn't lost," Ethan said. "He hid in plain sight, maybe even under their watch." He turned back toward Sarah. "The man in the security footage had his unit tattoo. If it's not him, it's someone who served with him and who still has access to this level of detail." "That means we're not the only ones decrypting," Sarah said. "Hale may have his own team pulling data from what they stole." Ethan nodded. "Then we beat them to what's left." He opened the storage locker where he had found the coin. Inside, taped beneath the lid, was another small envelope, paper, yellowed edges stiff from salt. He hadn't noticed it before. Inside was a single photograph, a group of Marines standing in front of the Sentinel years ago. His father was their younger arm around a man Ethan now recognized as a much younger Richard Hale. On the back in pencil, someone had written, "One ship, one secret." Ethan stared at it for a long moment before tucking it into his pocket. "He left me a trail," he said. "I think he wanted me to finish what he started." Sarah looked at him with quiet determination. "Then we find where those shipments went. If we can prove Hale Systems moved illegal arms, it ends their protection." Ethan closed the laptop, the words of the recording echoing through his head. "Forgive me, son." The sound of the rain gutter dripping outside became rhythmic, like a slow heartbeat. He looked down at Shadow, whose gaze still lingered on the now silent speakers. "He's gone," Ethan said softly. "But we're still listening." Shadow's ears twitched, and he rested his head again against Ethan's knee, a gesture of loyalty that carried both grief and strength. Sarah gathered her notes and stood. "There's a naval archive in Pensacola," she said. "If we can access the classified logs from 1989, we might trace where Project Guardian ended." Ethan nodded, pocketing the coin. "Then that's our next stop." He glanced once more around the cabin, the maps, the bullet-scarred wall, the empty space where his father's voice had filled the air. The pieces were aligning now, but the picture they formed carried more weight than he was ready to hold. As Sarah stepped onto the dock, the clouds thickened again over the horizon, promising more rain. Ethan stayed a moment longer beside the radio console, touching the worn microphone. "I heard you, Dad," he said quietly. "Now I'll finish it." The next evening found Ethan Cole driving west along the coastal highway, the sun sinking behind clouds tinted gold and crimson. The recording of his father's voice still echoed in his mind like an old song that refused to fade. Sarah had arranged a meeting with a contact in Tampa to discuss next steps, but an unexpected call had come instead. Richard Hale himself requesting a civil conversation at the Tampa Bay Yacht Club. The invitation was too deliberate to refuse. He needed to look the man in the eye. The club stood like a monument to old wealth-white columns, manicured palms, the quiet hum of privilege wrapped in ocean breeze. Ethan parked near the gate, aware that Shadow watched his every move from the passenger seat. "Stay," he said softly. The dog's amber eyes held steady as Ethan closed the door and walked toward the entrance. Inside, chandeliers glimmered over polished wood and framed photographs of regattas long past. Hale waited at a corner table overlooking the bay, dressed in a tailored navy suit. The same calm smile played across his face as when they'd first met, but now it felt heavier, deliberate. Mr. Cole Hale greeted rising. "I appreciate you coming." Ethan remained standing. "You didn't leave much of a choice." "On the contrary," Hale said, gesturing for him to sit. "You always have a choice. I'm offering you a better one." Ethan sat, keeping his posture guarded. A waiter appeared, set down 2 glasses of water, and disappeared as quickly as he came. Hale folded his hands. "You've done impressive work for a man with no resources. The file's the recording, it's remarkable how much you've uncovered." Ethan's jaw tightened. "My father uncovered it first. You just buried it." Hale smiled faintly. "Your father was a good man, caught between duty and survival. We gave him an option and he took it. I'm extending the same courtesy to you. He reached into his jacket, slid a small envelope across the table. Inside is a proposal. Property in Clearwater, trust accounts under your name, and a yearly allowance generous enough for any comfort you'd want. All I ask is discretion. Let the past rest. Ethan didn't touch the envelope. You want to buy silence. Hale's expression didn't change. I want to buy peace. You're a soldier, Mr. Cole. You know sometimes peace has a price. So does conscience, Ethan said evenly. Hale leaned back. Don't make your father's mistake. He thought truth would set him free. It only caged him. For a moment, neither spoke. The clink of glasses and faint piano music drifted through the room. Outside, the bay shimmered with reflections of dock lights. You're certain he's dead? Ethan asked finally. Hale's smile faded. We both attended his memorial. That should be enough. But you never saw the body, Ethan pressed. Hale's eyes flicked up cold now. Sometimes not seeing is mercy. The words landed like lead. Ethan stood. I'll find the rest of the truth whether you like it or not. Hale didn't stop him. He simply said, Be careful where you dig. Graves aren't always empty. Ethan left the club without looking back. The night air felt heavy, laced with salt and memory. He climbed into the truck. Shadow, sensing his tension, leaned forward from the back seat and pressed his muzzle against Ethan's shoulder. Let's go, Ethan said quietly. They drove out of Tampa, the road winding along dark stretches of coastline. His phone vibrated once Sarah's name, but when he answered, only static filled the line. He tried again. No response. Her last message came minutes earlier. Found something. We'll explain tonight. By the time Ethan reached Pelican Bay, the marina was dark except for a single lamp glowing in Tom Riley's office. Shadow jumped out first, nose to the wind. Something was wrong. The door to the Sentinel hung ajar. Inside on the table, where Sarah had left her research, lay her navy blue jacket, damp at the cuffs, as if dropped in haste. Her notebook was gone, and the laptop she had used for decryption had vanished. Ethan scanned the cabin. No struggle, no overturned chairs, but a faint chemical scent lingered sharp and sterile, the same solvent he had smelled before when the GPS tracker disappeared. Shadow began to sniff around the floor, then lifted his head toward the open hatch. Without waiting for command, he bounded down the gangway, nose to the dock, following a trail invisible to human eyes. Ethan followed, heart-pounding. The dog led him along the pier, past darkened boats and the flickering reflection of dock lights on wet planks until they reached the parking lot. Sarah's car was still there. Driver's door locked, passenger side slightly open. Ethan shone his flashlight inside. On the seat lay a key card embossed with the Hale Systems insignia. Shadow barked once, sharp and purposeful, and pulled toward the chain-link fence bordering the lot. Beyond it, a narrow road disappeared into a stretch of industrial warehouses. All right, boy, Ethan said. Lead the way. They crossed the road, rain beginning to fall again in fine mist. The dog stayed close to the ground, pausing at intersections, sniffing, then moving forward with determination. Each step brought them deeper into the maze of warehouses until a sign emerged from the dark Hale Systems logistics. Authorized personnel only. The building was unlit except for a single security lamp over the loading dock. Shadow stopped near the gate, ears, flat tail rigid. Ethan crouched beside him. The chain on the gate was new, still gleaming despite the weather. Through the fence he saw faint tire tracks curving toward the rear of the lot. She's inside, he said. The dog gave a low growl. Ethan checked the perimeter, one security camera, a locked side door, and a small vent near ground level where air drifted faintly outward. He reached through the fence, felt the metal's cold bite. The memory of Hale's offer replayed in his head. Peace has a price. So did silence. And now someone had decided Sarah's voice was too dangerous to leave free. He withdrew his hand and whispered, "Stay close." Shadow's eyes gleamed under the light, steady and focused. Ethan glanced once more toward the road, then at the building's dark windows. Somewhere inside those walls, Sarah might still be alive, or already beyond help. Either way, Hale had crossed from negotiation to threat, and Ethan knew what that meant. The soldier in him stirred again, precise and calm. He would not wait for morning. The warehouse loomed silent under the thin rain, its metal siding streaked with rust and time. Ethan crouched beside the gate, watching the faint flicker of a security light above the loading dock. Shadow stood beside him, nose lifted, ears pricked toward the far end of the building. "Find her," Ethan whispered. The dog moved low and quiet, weaving through the narrow space between fence and wall. Ethan followed, keeping to the shadows. The padlock on the side door had been replaced recently. He tested it and found it solid, but a ventilation hatch nearby hung crooked on one hinge. He loosened it and peered inside. The narrow passage smelled of dust oil and stagnant air. "Go," he said softly. Shadow slipped in first tail, brushing the frame, before vanishing into the dark. Ethan followed, crawling through until the passage opened into a service corridor lined with old conduit pipes. The hum of distant machinery echoed faintly, though the place looked long abandoned. They moved carefully, guided by Shadow's low growls and sudden pauses. A faint sound drifted from below, metal striking metal, rhythmic and deliberate. Ethan found a stairwell leading down into a lower chamber. The air grew colder, damp with the scent of seawater. At the bottom, under a hanging light, stood a rusted hatch half buried in the concrete floor. Shadow pawed at it, then stepped back. Ethan knelt, pried at the edge until the lock gave. The hatch opened with a groan, revealing a small compartment lined with corrugated steel. Inside was a metal box, thick and sealed. Dust coated its surface, but stamped across the top were 3 letters, CWC, Captain William Cole. Ethan lifted it free and set it on the ground. The latch resisted, then snapped open. Inside lay 2 items wrapped in faded cloth, a pair of military dog tags, and a small digital drive taped to a folded note. Ethan unfolded the paper, his breath catching as he read the handwriting. "If you find this, you've followed far enough. What they call treason was truth. Keep the record safe. Don't trust the uniform, only the men who earned it." He inserted the drive into his portable reader. A single video file appeared. The image flickered to life, a younger William Cole seated aboard the Sentinel, face lined with exhaustion but steady. "If you're watching this, it means Hale moved faster than I expected," the captain said. "They used my ship to transport weapons meant for conflicts no one would admit existed. I recorded every transaction, every manifest. The proof is with the veterans who refused to take part. They'll know what to do. The rest is in your hands, Ethan." The voice broke slightly. "I hope you never had to see this. But if you did remember, truth isn't clean. It costs everything." The video ended abruptly. Ethan stared at the screen until it dimmed the faint reflection of his face, replacing his father's. Shadow nudged his arm gently as if sensing the weight in the air. "He left it for me," Ethan whispered. "All of it." Before he could move, a noise rolled through the corridor, a vehicle engine followed by doors slamming shut. Shadow's ears snapped forward and he gave a short warning bark. Ethan extinguished the light and pulled back behind a stack of crates. Moments later, footsteps echoed heavy, coordinated, more than one set. The sound of rifles being chambered followed. Then a familiar voice, cool and deliberate, carried through the hollow space. "You never did know when to stop digging, Mr. Cole." Richard Hale stepped into view, flanked by armed men in tactical gear. The beams of their flashlights swept across the room, slicing through the dark. Hale's tone was almost casual. "You should have taken the offer. Now I have to close the file myself." Ethan stayed low hand on the pistol at his belt. "Where's Sarah?" he called out. Hale's smile flickered in the shifting light. "She's no longer a concern. She tried to be clever, but not clever enough." A movement behind Hale drew his attention. One of the guards stumbled forward with a grunt. something dark knocking him off balance. Shadow burst from the shadows, teeth bared, grabbing the man's sleeve and dragging him down before darting away. Chaos erupted. The flashlight swung wildly, shouts filling the air. Ethan fired once, the shot cracking through the old metal walls, not to kill but to scatter. He grabbed the iron box and ducked behind a support beam as bullets tore splinters from the crate beside him. Hale shouted, "Don't damage the evidence!" The momentary pause was all Ethan needed. He dashed toward the side corridor, Shadow at his heels. The dog moved fluidly despite the noise guiding him through the maze of steel and shadows. At the far end, Ethan saw a faint glow, someone's phone flashlight trembling in the dark. Sarah's voice rang low but urgent. She emerged from behind a rusted compressor, bruised but alive, clutching her phone. "Shadow found me when they brought me in," she said quickly. "I got away when the lights went out." She turned the phone screen toward him. It was streaming live to a veterans network she had contacted earlier. "They're watching everything she said. Hale's men can't shoot without witnesses now." Ethan looked past her shoulder. The feed showed comments flooding in from viewers identifying insignias and faces. Hale appeared in the doorway behind them, realization dawning as he saw the phone. His voice lost its composure. "End that stream," he barked. Two of his men advanced. Ethan fired again, grazing a pipe that sent steam hissing across the corridor. The air turned white with vapor. Shadow lunged at one of the approaching guards, catching his arm before the man could aim. A shot rang out too close, and the shepherd yelped, staggering but refusing to fall. Ethan dropped to his knees beside him, fury and fear colliding in his chest. "Stay down," he whispered. But Shadow pushed himself upright, teeth bared again. The second guard lifted his weapon toward Ethan, and before the trigger could tighten, Shadow leapt, slamming into the man's chest. The gun fired into the ceiling. Ethan swung his wrench, striking the rifle away. The guard crumpled. Hale backed toward the exit, shouting for retreat as voices echoed from outside, sirens approaching veterans calling through speakers that they had the live feed. Sarah held the phone steady despite shaking hands. Ethan knelt beside Shadow, pressing against the wound in his shoulder. "You're all right, buddy," he said, his voice breaking with urgency. The dog's breathing was labored, but steady eyes never leaving his handler's face. "He saved you," Sarah whispered. "He always does," Ethan answered softly. The sirens grew louder, blue lights flashing through cracks in the walls. Hale's men scattered into the night, but Hale himself paused at the threshold, rain streaming down his face. "This isn't over," he said coldly. "It never is," Ethan replied. Then the floodlights from arriving patrol boats cut through the storm, and Hale disappeared into the chaos. Ethan gathered Shadow into his arms, the dog's fur damp with both rain and blood. Together with Sarah, they stepped out into the open where truth and reckoning waited under the harsh white lights. The night bled slowly into morning, leaving the ruins of the old naval yard washed in a pale gray light. Smoke drifted from the collapsed hangar where Hale's men had made their final stand. The police had come and gone, federal agents marking off the scene, journalists swarming like gulls. Now the place was quiet again, the echo of sirens replaced by the steady rhythm of waves against the pier. Ethan Cole sat on the back of an ambulance, the blanket around his shoulders doing little to ease the chill. Shadow lay beside him, his front leg wrapped in white gauze, his eyes half closed but alert to every movement. Sarah Whitman stood nearby, talking quietly with a federal investigator, her face drawn but calm. The live broadcast had already spread across the network of veterans groups. Within hours, the video had reached Washington, and Hale Systems was under investigation. The empire that had built itself on silence was unraveling thread by thread. Ethan stared down at the metal box on his lap, the one he had retrieved from the hidden chamber. The drive was still inside, but now it was in government hands. He had kept only one item for himself, the folded letter his father had written all those years ago. He unfolded it again, reading the words by the dim morning light. "If you ever doubt what I did, remember this. the money they offered me was blood money. I returned it where it belonged to the sons and daughters of those who served. Tell them their fathers did not die for profit." Ethan looked up, eyes following the faint shimmer of dawn breaking over the bay. "He gave it all away," he murmured. Sarah turned toward him. "What do you mean?" "The payments," Ethan said. "Hale mentioned a transfer when he tried to buy me off. My father took it decades ago, but he didn't keep it. He put it into a scholarship fund for veterans' families. I checked the foundation records on the drive before they took it. The first donation came from an anonymous source in 1990, the same year he disappeared." Sarah smiled faintly. So he found his own way to make it right. He did more than that, Ethan said. He made sure the people Hale exploited would have a future. He couldn't save himself, but he saved them. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of ash from the burned-out hangar. The remains of the Sentinel towed from the bay after the firefight lay beached nearby. Her hull was scorched, the name barely visible through the soot, but she still held her shape, a survivor of storms, both man-made and natural. Ethan rose slowly, ignoring the ache in his shoulders, and walked toward her. Shadow followed, limping slightly but refusing to be left behind. The beach sand was damp and cool underfoot. The first line of sunlight broke across the horizon, glinting off shards of broken glass and fragments of metal that had once been part of something proud. Ethan stopped beside the wreckage, his reflection faint in the warped brass letters. He knelt, running his hand along the ruined hull. "You carried his secret for half a lifetime," he whispered. Shadow sniffed the sand near the stern tail, low nose moving in small, deliberate arcs. Then the dog paused, pawed once, and leaned down. His jaws closed gently around something half buried in soot. He turned toward Ethan and released it onto the sand, a small Marine Corps coin, the same one Ethan had found months earlier, but thought lost during the chaos of the fight. The sunlight caught the edge of the metal, revealing fresh engraving that hadn't been there before. Across the surface, scratched with a careful hand, were the words, "Semper Fidelis Son." Ethan felt the breath leave him. He picked up the coin warm from the dog's mouth and turned it over. The original emblem was still there, the eagle globe and anchor, but now beneath it lay the final message, the one his father must have carved before sealing it away. "Always faithful," Ethan said softly, voice thick with emotion. Shadow pressed closer, resting his head against Ethan's knee. Sarah approached quietly, her shoes crunching over the wet sand. "They're saying Hale will face charges," she said. "The recordings and files you found are being authenticated. It's over." Ethan shook his head. "For him, maybe. For my father, it ended a long time ago." He looked back at the horizon where the rising sun cut a line of gold across the water. The gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp and clean. "He carried the guilt so I wouldn't have to," Ethan continued. "He wanted me to find the truth, but also to understand why he disappeared. Now I do." Sarah folded her arms. "What will you do now?" "Rebuild her," Ethan said, glancing at the Sentinel, not as a ship for secrets, but as something to honor what he stood for. He looked down at Shadow. "And he'll help me keep watch." They stood together in silence as the sky shifted from gray to rose. The waves reached up to the edge of the hull, washing soot from the metal, as if the sea itself was offering absolution. Shadow stirred, rising despite the bandage around his leg, and limped toward the shallow water. Ethan followed the coin still in his hand. The dog waded in until the surf reached his chest, then turned eyes bright under the soft light. Ethan laughed quietly, the sound breaking through the weight that had settled in his chest for so long. "You're tougher than both of us," he said. Shadow wagged his tail once, then looked back toward the wreck as if guarding it even now. Ethan crouched beside him, one hand resting on the dog's head, the other holding the coin above the water. The light of dawn caught the engraving again, reflecting a glint that seemed almost alive. "Semper Fidelis," he said, voice steady now. "Always faithful." The tide reached his boots, warm and forgiving. Behind them, the last smoke from the warehouse drifted upward and dissolved into the morning air. Sarah stood by the shore, watching as the two of them faced the sunrise. She understood without words that this was the end of one war and the quiet beginning of something else, a life measured not in battles, but in memory and grace. The sun climbed higher, flooding the bay with light. Ethan slipped the coin into his pocket, then turned toward the sentinel one last time. The charred hull caught the light, and for a brief instant gleamed as though reborn. Shadow looked up at him, eyes steady, waiting for command. "Let's go home," Ethan said softly. They walked together up the beach, the dog's limp already easing with each step. Behind them the water washed over the footprints they left, erasing the marks of what had been leaving only the morning calm of a Florida shore reclaimed by peace. If this story kept you on the edge, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to follow the next chapter. Tell me what you think. Was Ethan right to uncover his father's secret? Or should he have let the sentinel rest in peace? And where are you watching from tonight? Drop your thoughts and location in the comments below. Your voice keeps these stories alive.